The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Daniel Crawford, echoing through the marble corridors of Sterling Capitol Tower like a final verdict. His polished shoes dragged across the Fram's floor, no longer carrying the proud stride of Wall Street's golden strategist, but the broken steps of a man staring into the abyss. Just hours earlier, Daniel had been the firm's star investment chief, celebrated for his uncanny instincts and the billions he had added to the company's wealth. Now, in the span of a single meeting, his career, his reputation, and his family's future were collapsing under the weight of a single, staggering accusation he had lost $1 billion in one deal. The boardroom confrontation replayed mercilessly in his mind. 12 directors had sat in judgment, their expressions carved with anger and disbelief. At the head of the table, Chairman Richard Alden's voice had sliced through the air with the cold sharpness of a blade. "Daniel, explain to us how one man could jeopardize everything we've built." No answer he gave could satisfy them. The Shanghai Metals contract, once hailed as a flawless, foolproof triumph, had evaporated into smoke. Wire transfers had vanished into phantom accounts, authentication systems had mysteriously failed, and the financial empire he had spent decades defending suddenly crumbled like glass beneath a hammer. As Daniel loosened his silk tie in the deserted hallway, the numbers pounded against his skull. 1.5 billion. Gone. He thought of Helen, his wife of 15 years, preparing dinner at their home in Greenwich, unaware that their Hamptons estate, their daughter Sophie's private school, and the very life they had built together could soon be stripped away. He thought of Sophie herself, just 8 years old, her laughter still fresh from last night's piano practice. How could he tell her that her father might soon be disgraced and ruined? Yet even as despair threatened to consume him, something gnawed at the edges of his mind. The deal had been too perfect, the collapse too precise, the accusations too rehearsed. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a trap. And as Daniel pressed his hand against the cold marble wall, tears burning his eyes for the first time in 20 years, he swore a silent vow: he would uncover the truth, even if it destroyed him. The October air outside Sterling Capitol Tower was sharp and clear, the kind of day when the Manhattan skyline glittered with possibility. Yet for Daniel Crawford, it felt more like a cruel joke, a perfect day mocking the ruins of his career. As he stepped out of the boardroom that morning, the weight of the accusation pressed against him like an iron shackle. He had been accused of losing $1.5 billion in a deal that had been hailed as foolproof, and by tomorrow, the final vote on his termination would be cast. But as the hours stretched on, Daniel's despair began to harden into suspicion. Something about the entire debacle gnawed at him. The timing was too neat, too exact. He had been planning a short vacation with his family, his first in nearly 3 years. When suddenly, the Shanghai Metals transaction unraveled with surgical precision. The evidence against him seemed airtight. Emails traced to his computer, digital signatures carrying his authorization, codes, and financial trails that pointed squarely at his desk. It was almost too perfect, as though someone had painted a target on his back with deliberate care. Daniel replayed the boardroom scene in his mind, studying not only the words spoken but the way certain members had behaved. Richard Alden, the chairman, had kept his tone calm and authoritative, but Daniel noticed something unusual. Alden's questions had been unnervingly sharp, as though rehearsed. Instead of genuine curiosity or shock, they carried the cadence of the WAMS. Accusations prepared long before the meeting began. And then there was Evelyn Tran, the firm's chief financial officer, who had sat with arms folded tightly across her crimson suit, eyes gleaming with something that looked far too much like satisfaction. She had spoken little, but every word dripped with subtle venom. The evidence speaks for itself, Daniel. This was either incompetence or negligence. Neither can be tolerated. But Evelyn's certainty bothered him. She had not even paused to consider the possibility of fraud or external sabotage. Instead, she seemed to push for the narrative of Daniel's failure, like an actress playing a role she had memorized too well. Across the table, Jonathan Price, head of international operations, had fidgeted nervously with his glasses, his face pale yet his words carefully chosen. He, too, had leaned into the story of Daniel's downfall, echoing Evelyn's conclusions almost word for word. It wasn't just what they said, it was the way they said it. Daniel had spent over 2 decades in finance, long enough to recognize when numbers didn't add up, but also long enough to read people. And in that room, some of the faces he had once considered allies looked disturbingly prepared for his execution. Later, alone in his office, Daniel pored over the Shanghai deal once again. The contracts had been meticulously reviewed. He had triple-checked every clause, every condition. The authentication systems had verified the signatures. The backup servers had recorded every step. Yet when the $1.5 billion wire was executed, it had slipped through his personal codes and vanished into a phantom account that disappeared within hours. The more he studied the documents, the less they resembled a mistake, and the more they resembled sabotage. His phone buzzed on the desk, another message from Helen, his wife, asking if he would be home for dinner. She had sensed the storm in his silence, but Daniel could not bear to admit the truth. He typed out a reply, erased it, then pushed the phone aside. The image of his daughter, Sophie, floated in his mind. Only 8 years old, she had an uncanny ability to read his moods, always asking the questions no one else dared. How could he look into her bright, trusting eyes, and confess that her father might be ruined? That their world might collapse? Overnight? Daniel rose from his chair and moved toward the wide glass window. From the 52nd floor, Central Park stretched out in vivid autumn colors, a sea of gold and crimson beneath the bellers. Fading light. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, his reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes. Who wants me gone? He wondered. And why now? The pieces began to form a darker picture. Evelyn Tran had always been ambitious, her sharp intellect matched only by her hunger for control. She had clashed with Daniel before, particularly when he blocked her proposal for a risky merger last year. Jonathan Price, meanwhile, had been passed over for promotions more than once because Daniel's strategies consistently outperformed his. Together, they had motive. Together, they could have engineered a plan. And Richard Alden, the chairman whose steady leadership had once seemed unshakable, might not be as neutral as he appeared. Daniel recalled the fleeting crack in Alden's composure when he had suggested the timing of the disaster was remarkably convenient. It was the only moment the chairman's mask had slipped, revealing a flicker of unease. If Alden knew more than he admitted, then perhaps the rot within Sterling Capital was deeper than Daniel imagined. That night, Daniel could not sleep. He paced the length of his study at home, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls, lined with diplomas, awards, and photographs of happier times. The words of the board echoed in his mind, mingling with the silence of the Sowerlaus house. Sophie's crayon drawings lay scattered on his desk, innocent reminders of the life he stood to lose. As midnight passed, he sat heavily in his leather chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. Yet, beneath the fatigue, a fire was growing. He would not allow himself to be the scapegoat of a conspiracy. Whoever had orchestrated this scheme had underestimated him. They had counted on his silence, his despair, his willingness to accept blame. But Daniel Crawford was not done. He would investigate every email, every transfer, every hidden corner of the deal, until he found the crack in their armor. He would uncover the truth, no matter how deep he had to dig, or how dangerous it became. Somewhere in the mountain of data and the shadows of boardroom politics, there was evidence, a thread that, once pulled, would unravel the entire scheme. And as he leaned forward, staring at the files scattered before him, Daniel whispered a vow into the quiet of the night. You may have trapped me once, but I will not fall again. Tomorrow, I start fighting back. The morning of the final board meeting dawned cold and merciless. The Manhattan skyline glittered in the pale October sun, but for Daniel Crawford, the day felt heavy with dread. By 9 o'clock, he would walk into a room where 12 powerful figures waited to seal his fate. No matter how many times he replayed the details of the Shanghai Metals deal, no matter how often he scoured the documents for hidden clues, the evidence pointed back to him like a damning spotlight. The system logs showed his credentials. The timestamps tied the transfer to his desk. Even the backup records confirmed the same story. It was as though the truth had been carefully rewritten, leaving him with no defense. At home, however, something unexpected was stirring. 8-year-old Sophie Crawford had spent the evening before crawling under her father's mahogany desk, looking for a purple crayon she had dropped while coloring. What she found instead were several pages that had slipped through a crack in the desk and landed behind the cabinet. Printed emails, bank confirmations, and a set of documents with strange markings. At first, she didn't fully understand them, but Sophie had always been unusually sharp for her age. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had taught the class to read carefully, to notice small details, and to ask questions when something didn't make sense. Sophie did just that. The first thing she noticed was the time stamps. One email, sent from Evelyn Tran's office. Computer, showed a message to Shanghai Metals at 2:47 p.m., promising that funds were on their way. Yet according to the records, her father's supposed transfer had not occurred until 3:15 p.m. How, Sophie wondered, could someone promise money before it had even been sent? Another document referenced a secret address under the name J. Price, clearly tied to Jonathan Price, the head of international operations. Even in her childlike way, Sophie knew something was wrong. She gathered the papers into a folder, her small hands clutching them tightly, and whispered to herself, "Daddy's in trouble. I have to help." That morning, while Helen anxiously drove her daughter into the city, Daniel sat at one end of the long mahogany boardroom table, his body rigid, his eyes hollow. Richard Alden, the chairman, stood at the head, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Around him, the other board members waited like a tribunal, their expressions severe. "Mr. Crawford," Alden began, his voice resonant and cold, "you've had 24 hours to prepare an explanation for what occurred yesterday. Before we proceed with the vote, do you have anything to say?" Daniel rose to his feet, his hands trembling slightly. He wanted to fight back, to accuse Evelyn and Jonathan of conspiring, but without proof, his words would sound like the desperate ramblings of a man cornered. The silence in the room thickened, each second pulling him closer to professional ruin. And then, the doors swung open. Every head turned as a small figure stepped inside. Sophie Crawford, dressed in her navy school uniform, clutched a manila folder to her chest. Her mother Helen stood at the doorway, frozen between pride and fear. For a moment, the entire boardroom seemed stunned into disbelief. What was a child doing here, in the middle of such high-stakes deliberations? "Sweetheart, you can't be here right now," Daniel said quickly, dropping to one knee beside his chair, his face flushed with panic. "Daddy's in a very important meeting." But Sophie's voice rang out with a clarity that cut through the tension like a bell. "They're blaming you for something you didn't do, Daddy. I found proof." The room erupted in whispers, several board members exchanging incredulous glances. Evelyn Tran's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing irritation. Richard Alden's brows furrowed as he barked, "This is highly irregular. Mr. Crawford, remove your daughter at once." "No," Sophie said firmly, her small hand trembling as she opened the folder. "You need to see these papers. They fell behind Daddy's desk at home. I read them. They show the truth." She spread the documents across the polished table, the pages fluttering like a storm of secrets. With the innocent precision of a child, she pointed to the highlighted times. "Look, Mrs. Tran's computer sent an email at 2:47, saying the money was already coming. But Daddy's computer didn't send anything until 3:15. How could she know before he even pressed the button?" The silence that followed was absolute. A grandfather clock ticked ominously in the corner, the only sound in the cavernous room. Jonathan Price shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face draining of color. One of the directors leaned closer, scanning the paper with shaking fingers. This doesn't match the logs we reviewed earlier," he muttered. Sophie pressed on, her voice growing stronger. "And this paper shows an email from Mrs. Tran's computer to Mr. Price's secret account at 2:52. It says, 'Package delivered as discussed. Crawford will take the fall.'" She looked up, her innocent eyes unflinching. "That means they planned it. They wanted to make my daddy look guilty." Evelyn's composure cracked. Her confident smirk faltered as whispers swept through the Stoddard's boardroom. "This is nonsense," she snapped, her voice rising. "These documents are fabricated. This is a child's misinterpretation." But Sophie shook her head. "Mrs. Patterson taught us to look at computer information at the bottom of pages. This number here, it's like a fingerprint. It shows the papers came from your computer, Mrs. Tran. Not Daddy's." The board members leaned in, studying the metadata Sophie had circled in yellow marker. It was undeniable. Richard Alden's face hardened as he turned toward Evelyn and Jonathan. His voice carried the weight of decades in power. "Explain this. Now." Jonathan began to rise, his mouth opening with a desperate excuse, but before he could speak, Elizabeth Hartman, the firm's compliance officer, slammed a hand on the table. Her face had turned ashen as she flipped through the documents, realization dawning with horror. "Don't, Jonathan," she whispered. "They have everything. The emails, the authorizations, the transfers. It's over." The room descended into chaos. Security was called. Evelyn and Jonathan's protests filled the air as guards escorted them from the boardroom. Alden barked orders to lock their offices, revoke their access, and contact the FBI immediately. Amid the storm, Sophie slipped her small hand into her father's. She looked up at him with a shy smile, her confidence giving way to the fragility of a child. "Are you still in trouble, Daddy? Can we go home now and have ice cream?" Daniel's throat tightened. Tears he had held back for days finally spilled down his cheeks. He pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. "No, Princess. Thanks to you, Daddy's not in trouble anymore. And yes, tonight, we'll have all the ice cream you want." The boardroom of Sterling Capital Tower, usually a stage for polished negotiations and carefully orchestrated deals, now throbbed with chaos. A storm had broken the polished veneer of order. The documents little Sophie Crawford had laid across the mahogany table were no longer scraps of forgotten paper, they were weapons. Each email, each timestamp, each line of metadata struck like a blade against the reputation of executives who moments earlier had seemed untouchable. Daniel Crawford could scarcely believe what was happening. For the past 48 hours, he had been certain his career, his family, and his name were doomed. He had walked into this room expecting humiliation, dismissal, perhaps even criminal charges. Instead, his 8-year-old daughter had turned the narrative on its head, with a calm voice and undeniable logic that silenced the most powerful men and women in finance. At the far end of the table, Richard Alden, the chairman, studied the incriminating papers. With a face carved in stone, he had seen crises before, market crashes, hostile takeovers, scandals that shook entire industries, but nothing like this. His hands trembled slightly as he read the lines Sophie had highlighted in yellow marker. "Crawford will take the fall as planned." "Evelyn," Alden said, his voice low but edged with fury, "explain this now." Evelyn Tran, once the firm's most confident and calculating officer, sat frozen. Her red power suit no longer exuded dominance but betrayal, its color garish under the harsh fluorescent lights. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but nothing came. Beside her, Jonathan Price pushed back his chair, his face pale as marble. "This is taken out of context," he muttered, though his voice shook. They must be forgeries." No second grader could possibly understand financial documents of this scale. Sophie raised her chin, unflinching. "I can read very well, Mr. Price. And Mrs. Patterson taught us that times have to make sense. This email was sent before Daddy's transfer happened. That means you knew before it even occurred. You planned it." The clarity of her statement, delivered with childlike certainty, was devastating. Several directors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another. Their eyes, once filled with suspicion toward Daniel, now turned toward Evelyn and Jonathan with dawning horror. Then came Elizabeth Hartman, the compliance officer. She had remained quiet until now, her eyes darting between the documents, her mind racing with legal implications. Suddenly, she stood, slamming her hand against the table. "Enough. I've seen enough." The room froze. Elizabeth's voice cracked with urgency as she addressed the chairman. "Mr. Alden, these documents are authentic, the metadata is irrefutable. I recognize the authorization codes. Evelyn's, Jonathan's, and mine." Her admission hung heavy in the air like a confession of sin. Daniel's breath caught. "Elizabeth too?" She nodded grimly, reading the disbelief on his face. "Yes. I was complicit. Not by choice, at first, but once drawn in, I didn't see a way out. The plan was carefully crafted, used Daniel's spotless record, his reputation for integrity, and his trusted credentials as the perfect cover. If the deal unraveled, he would carry the blame, and no one would question it." Her voice faltered, shame etched across her features. "But this child..." She looked at Sophie with tears brimming. "This child uncovered what all our systems, our auditors, and our regulators missed." The directors erupted into chaos. Some demanded immediate answers, others shouted for order. Richard Alden banged his gavel repeatedly, the sound echoing like gunshots. "Silence," he thundered. The room stilled, the gravity of the moment settling like a suffocating fog. "Security," Alden commanded, his eyes never leaving Evelyn and Jonathan. Escort these individuals from the building at once. Lock down their offices. Revoke all access credentials. And someone call the FBI. Now. The two executives leapt to their feet, desperation replacing arrogance. You can't do this. Evelyn shouted, her voice high-pitched and cracking. This is a misunderstanding. You'll regret this, Richard. You'll regret listening to a child. Jonathan tried to push past the guards, but Elizabeth caught his arm, her voice low and final. Stop fighting, Jonathan. It's over. The guards seized them both, their protests echoing down the corridor as they were dragged out. The board members sat in stunned silence, many still staring at the highlighted words Sophie had spread before them. In the quiet that followed, Richard Alden removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. Mr. Crawford, he said slowly, his voice heavy with regret, I owe you an apology. It appears you were the victim of a deliberate and calculated scheme. One that may reach far, deeper than we imagined. Daniel could not speak. His throat tightened with emotion, his body shaking with the release of days of tension. He turned to Sophie, who stood by his side, her small hand gripping his tightly. Her expression was calm but determined, the seriousness of what she had done only just beginning to register. Helen, who had been standing just outside the room, rushed forward and gathered her daughter in her arms. You were so brave, sweetheart, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You saved your father. The FBI arrived within the hour. Agents in dark suits filled the boardroom, gathering documents, securing computers, and questioning witnesses. The once pristine sanctuary of Sterling Capital had transformed into a crime scene. Laptops were confiscated, files boxed and labeled, and surveillance footage pulled for analysis. Daniel sat silently as Agent Maria Rodriguez, a seasoned investigator, reviewed the incriminating evidence Sophie had presented. She nodded with professional approval. This is extraordinary. We've been tracing a network of financial fraud for years, and this could be the breakthrough we needed. Mr. Crawford, your daughter may have just exposed one of the most sophisticated embezzlement schemes we've ever encountered. Sophie looked up, her innocence cutting through the gravity of the moment. Does that mean Daddy's not in trouble anymore? Maria crouched to her level, a rare smile softening her stern features. That's right, Sophie. Thanks to you, your daddy's safe. And thanks to you, a lot of very bad people are going to Yale. The little girl nodded solemnly, as though she had simply completed a school project rather than dismantled a corporate conspiracy. She tugged on her father's sleeve. Can we go home now, Daddy? Maybe have ice cream? Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he would never let go. His tears finally fell, not of despair, but of relief. Yes, princess. We'll have ice cream tonight. More than you can eat. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile. But as the agents led Evelyn, Jonathan, and Elizabeth away in handcuffs, Daniel caught the cold look in Richard Alden's eyes. The chairman seemed less relieved than calculating, as though this crisis was only the surface of something larger. And in that moment, Daniel knew the battle was far from over. The weeks that followed the dramatic boardroom confrontation turned the Crawford family's quiet life into a spectacle they never could have imagined. For Daniel Crawford, the nightmare of being falsely accused had ended, but another storm had just begun. His name, once tarnished, now appeared daily on headlines, not as the villain but as the victim, and as the father of the little girl, dubbed Wall Street's young detective. News vans lined the leafy street outside their Connecticut home. Strangers mailed letters of admiration. Publishers sent book contracts. Sophie's schoolteachers whispered in awe, but beneath the sudden fame, an unease hung heavy. The FBI investigation, led by Agent Maria Rodriguez, quickly uncovered that the Rache conspiracy involving Evelyn Tran, Jonathan Price, and Elizabeth Hartman was not an isolated scheme. Instead, it was just the surface of a sprawling criminal network that reached far beyond Sterling Capital. For years, the group had been siphoning money through phantom accounts, manipulating deals, and framing innocent executives to cover their tracks. At least a dozen other financial leaders across the country had been ruined in similar fashion, disgraced, terminated, or imprisoned under suspicious circumstances. Daniel sat in his kitchen one morning, the granite counter buried beneath stacks of official documents the FBI had shared with him. Helen brewed coffee silently, her eyes darting to the growing pile of evidence. Sophie sat at the table drawing in her coloring book, her purple crayon scratching across the page as though nothing was wrong. But she listened, always listening. "This is bigger than anything I've seen in 20 years. Maria explained during one of her frequent visits. She spread photographs and charts across the table, connecting names, accounts, and companies with red lines that looked like a spider's web of corruption. "We believe over 50 individuals are involved, spanning multiple firms in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, even Miami. They aren't just embezzling, they're infiltrating regulatory agencies and manipulating promotions inside corporations. And your daughter's discovery has given us the thread to unravel the entire web." Daniel rubbed his temples, struggling to take it all in. "So Evelyn, Jonathan, Elizabeth, they were just pawns?" "Not pawns," Maria corrected firmly. "Players. But there are others above them, more dangerous, more powerful. We're naming this case the Sterling Network. And, Mr. Crawford, I need you to understand something very clearly. By exposing it, your family has become a target." Her warning proved chillingly prophetic. 3 weeks after Evelyn's arrest, shocking news reached them. Evelyn Tran had been found dead in her jail cell. At first, the report called it a suicide. But the preliminary autopsy told another story: faint bruising on her neck, toxins in her bloodstream, and tampered security footage. Someone had silenced her before she could name names. When Helen hung up the phone after hearing the news, her face went pale. "They killed her," she whispered, to keep her quiet. Sophie, overhearing, set down her crayon with a frown. "Does this mean the bad people are still out there?" Daniel and Helen exchanged a glance filled with fear and unspoken understanding. Their daughter had stumbled into a war far larger than they had imagined. Within days, the FBI insisted the Crawfords enter the Federal Witness Protection Program. Maria herself delivered the news. Sitting in their living room, her dark eyes were steady but urgent. "Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, the network has already proven it can reach into prisons. That means you're not safe in your own home. Your daughter is the key witness. Without her, this case collapses. We need to move you to a safe house immediately." The next morning, under the cover of darkness, black SUVs whisked them away from their home. Sophie clutched her stuffed rabbit and the folder of documents she had discovered weeks earlier, as though they were twin talismans of courage. They left behind their neighbors, their routines, even Sophie's beloved purple-walled bedroom. The safe house was a modest ranch in rural Virginia, hidden among rolling hills. From the outside, it looked ordinary, but the surrounding farmhands were in fact armed federal agents. Inside, the walls were bare, the furniture simple, and the atmosphere tense. For Sophie, the sudden isolation was both confusing and lonely. "I miss my friends," she whispered one night, curling up beside her mother on the worn sofa. "Do they think I just disappeared?" Helen stroked her daughter's hair, her own heart breaking. "The FBI told your school you're helping with something very important. Mrs. Patterson knows you're safe. She's proud of you, sweetheart." Despite the assurances, the weeks of confinement weighed heavily. Daniel grew restless, eating more than usual, while Helen developed insomnia. Sophie, though outwardly calm, grew quieter, her drawings shifting from cheerful flowers to shadowy shapes of buildings and bars. Maria Rodriguez visited often, bringing updates. Each time, the network grew larger, darker. "We've uncovered over 60 individuals connected," she explained one evening, spreading fresh files across their dining table. "They've infiltrated even the Treasury Department. We've recovered $400 million already, but we estimate billions more stolen." And Sophie's testimony is the key to securing convictions. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "So until she testifies, we're just sitting ducks." Maria didn't sugarcoat it. "That's the truth. These people are desperate. They've killed once, and they may try again." One night, as Daniel tucked Sophie into bed, she asked a question that pierced his soul. "Daddy, are the bad people angry at me? Do they want to hurt me because I found their papers?" Daniel froze, then knelt beside her, his hand clasping hers. "Yes, princess. They are angry. But listen to me, you are the bravest girl I know. And you are not alone. There are good people, like Agent Rodriguez, working every day to keep us safe. Mommy and I will protect you, with everything we have. You saved me, Sophie. And together, we'll get through this." Sophie nodded, her small face lit with solemn determination far beyond her years. "Then I'll Be brave again, Daddy. If I have to tell the truth in court to stop them, I will. Daniel kissed her forehead, his heart aching with pride and fear. In that moment, he realized, his daughter was no longer just a child caught in a storm. She had become the beacon, guiding them through it. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had been transformed into a fortress. Metal, detectors, armed marshals, and plain-clothed agents lined every hallway. For weeks, headlines had declared the moment the trial of the century. But for Sophie Crawford, just 8 years old, it was another chance to do what she had always believed and tell the truth. Dressed in a navy blue dress with white trim and a ribbon in her auburn hair, Sophie sat in the second witness chair, her small legs swinging slightly above the floor. A special booster seat had been provided so she could see over the rail. Across the courtroom, the gallery was packed. Journalists, families of ruined executives, victims whose retirement accounts had been saved by her discovery, and leaders from Wall Street firms. Cameras were barred, but the weight of the nation's eyes seemed to press down on the room. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Stevens approached the witness stand with a reassuring smile. His tone was gentle, his words carefully chosen. Sophie, can you tell the jury how you first found the papers that started all of this? The little girl nodded, her voice clear. I was in my daddy's study at home, looking for my purple crayon. It rolled under his big desk. When I crawled underneath, I saw some papers stuck behind it. They had fallen down through a crack. I pulled them out. When I read them, the times didn't make sense. One email said the money was coming before my daddy ever sent it. That's how I knew something was wrong. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Her explanation was simple, but its logic was unshakable. Defense attorney Robert Hawkins, representing Jonathan Price, rose for cross-examination. At 62, Hawkins was infamous for tearing apart witnesses, but his usual intimidation tactics faltered before the calm innocence of a child. Sophie, he began, his voice measured. These are very complicated financial papers. Isn't it possible you misunderstood what you read? Sophie tilted her head, her eyes bright but firm. No, sir. Mrs. Patterson, my teacher, says I read at a middle school level. And I know how to tell time. If someone says 2:47 p.m. and another paper says 3:15 p.m., then 2:47 came first. That means they knew before my daddy ever pressed the button. Jurors nodded, some even smiling at the sheer clarity of her answer. Hawkins tried again, pressing. Did your father tell you what to say today? No, Sophie replied without hesitation. Daddy didn't even see the papers until I brought them to his office. I figured it out myself. Because telling the truth, even when it's scary, is the right thing to do. The courtroom fell silent. Even seasoned prosecutors exchanged glances, recognizing the weight of her words. On redirect, Prosecutor Stevens projected enlarged copies of the incriminating documents onto screens. Sophie pointed to the highlights she had made in yellow marker months earlier. This email came from Mrs. Tran's computer at 2:47. It told Shanghai Metals the money was coming. But my daddy's computer didn't send the money until 3:15. That means she was part of the plan. Her small finger then landed on another page. This one says, Crawford will take the fall as planned. That means they were going to blame my daddy for something he didn't do. By the time she finished, the jury was leaning forward, riveted not by technical jargon but by the undeniable logic of an 8-year-old child. When Sophie stepped down from the stand, escorted by her mother, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Her testimony had pierced the sophisticated defenses of the accused with the simplicity of truth. In the weeks that followed, her evidence and the FBI's investigation dismantled the Sterling network entirely. Dozens of executives, regulators, and financial officers were convicted. Over $600 million was recovered and returned to families, employees, and companies who had been robbed. For Daniel Crawford, the relief was immeasurable. He had not only been saved from ruin but had watched his daughter become the voice of justice. And as Sophie clutched her father's hand outside the courthouse, she whispered the same words she had spoken months earlier. Daddy, can we have ice cream now? This time, his answer came with a proud, tearful smile. Yes, princess. Today, you've saved more than me. You've saved countless families. And the world will never forget it. The storm that once threatened to destroy the Crawford family ended with a legacy far greater than they ever imagined. Daniel Crawford was fully reinstated at Sterling Capital, honored not only with a promotion but with a reputation cleansed of doubt. His family, once hunted by shadows, could finally breathe in safety again. But the greatest transformation did not belong to him, it belonged to his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. Her courage was recognized by the highest levels of government. In a ceremony broadcast nationwide, Sophie received the Presidential Citizens Medal, her small hands clutching the Golden Seal, as the president himself called her a light of truth in an age of deception. She would later stand at the podium of Harvard Business School, addressing a hall filled with executives, professors, and future leaders. With the clarity only a child could bring, she reminded them that honesty is like a light once lit, it reveals everything hidden in the dark. Thousands of children and families wrote letters to her, inspired to believe that no voice is too small, and no truth too insignificant to matter. Sometimes, the greatest power comes not from wealth, age, or influence, but from the simple courage to speak up. Sophie's story proves that truth can be found in the smallest details and that even a child's voice can change the world. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below about a moment when truth changed your life. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can be inspired to live with courage and integrity.